In January of 1945, within a frigid warehouse on Berlin's periphery, Dr. Hinrich Becker, the chief engineer for Herzversuchen Kumdorf, Germany's foremost weapons development center, examined the artifacts before him. Three American artillery projectiles, measuring 105 millimeters in caliber, had been retrieved from the Ardennes battlefield. Externally, they appeared unremarkable, standard high-explosive rounds that had been consistently impacting German positions for months. However, these shells were exceptional. They had been discovered unexploded, embedded in snow near the town of Bastonia, and the accompanying reports were deeply unsettling. Frontline soldiers spoke of a novel American ordnance, artillery shells that detonated in midair with unparalleled accuracy, showering the earth with shrapnel from above. These projectiles rendered foxholes and trenches obsolete, shells that seemed to possess an innate sense of timing for their explosive release. The reports seemed utterly implausible. Airburst artillery necessitated precise timing mechanisms, calculated by seasoned artillery crews based on range, altitude, and prevailing weather conditions. Achieving accuracy was challenging. Consistent precision was nearly unattainable. To achieve such results amidst a blizzard, with minimal visibility and the chaos of active combat, seemed beyond any military's capacity. Yet, the Americans were seemingly accomplishing this with every firing. Becker had been summoned to ascertain the method. As he meticulously commenced the dismantling of the first shell, removing its nose cone to reveal the fuse assembly, Becker was unaware that his discovery would extend beyond a mere explanation for a tactical anomaly. It would unveil the fundamental reality of Germany's losing conflict, a war not of soldiers and strategies, but of scientific prowess and industrial might on an almost unimaginable scale. Becker worked with deliberate precision, documenting each stage of disassembly with photographs. His hands remained steady, despite the inherent danger. Even a malfunctioning artillery shell posed a significant threat. A single misstep, an unintended activation, could result in his demise. Upon finally extracting the outer casing of the fuse assembly, he paused. For a prolonged moment, he simply stared. Within the shell's nose resided a device utterly alien to him. It was a compact arrangement of components, meticulously machined and carefully integrated. Initially, it resembled a diminutive radio set, an idea that struck him as impossible. Radios were delicate instruments requiring careful handling. The notion of housing one within an artillery shell subjected to forces 20,000 times gravity upon firing was preposterous. Becker beckoned his assistant, Headman Franz Weber, an electrical engineer formerly employed by Telefunen. "Franz, come observe this," he requested. "Tell me what you discern." Weber leaned over the table, his eyes widening in astonishment. That appears to be a radio transmitter, a receiver, and what seems to be an amplifier circuit." He hesitated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Doctor, this cannot be correct. These components should not survive being discharged from a cannon." Becker nodded slowly. Yet they did. This shell was fired. The rifling marks on its casing confirm its passage through a barrel. Somehow, impossibly, this radio apparatus endured the launch and remained operational. Over the ensuing hours, Becker and his team meticulously cataloged every component. They identified a miniature vacuum tube, smaller than any produced in Germany, a battery system featuring an ingenious activation mechanism, an antenna that deployed post-firing, and a trigger circuit linked to the primary explosive charge. As they mapped the system's architecture, its function became apparent: a proximity fuse. The transmitter emitted radio waves. As the shell neared the ground, the reflected waves would initiate detonation at the optimal altitude for an airburst. No calculations were necessary, no timing mechanisms required. The shell itself determined its detonation point. The elegance of the design was breathtaking, but as an engineer, Becker grasped its implications immediately, and they were grim. Becker sat at his desk, engrossed in the component analysis. Each element of the American fuse represented a substantial engineering triumph. Collectively, they signified capabilities far beyond Germany's current reach. The vacuum tubes presented the initial challenge. In 1945, German vacuum tubes were comparatively large, fragile components, necessitating careful handling and unable to withstand significant impact. The Americans had somehow miniaturized and reinforced them to endure the stresses of artillery launch. This alone hinted at a manufacturing sophistication that was deeply concerning. But the situation worsened. The battery system was a stroke of genius. It incorporated a glass vial filled with electrolyte. The shock of firing the shell would fracture the vial, allowing the liquid to interact with the battery components, thus activating the power source. This implied the battery could remain inert indefinitely, activating only when needed. German engineers had contemplated such a system, but its implementation demanded precision glasswork, expertly formulated electrolytes, and quality control standards that German factories, increasingly targeted by bombing and reliant on forced labor, could no longer uphold. Becker convened his senior staff. Gathered around the table were some of Germany's most seasoned weapons engineers. He presented his findings. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are examining a functional miniaturized radar system engineered to withstand artillery discharge. The Americans have overcome challenges that have plagued us for years. The pivotal question is this: can we replicate it?" The ensuing discussion was sobering. Every engineer present recognized the brilliance of the design. Every engineer also understood Germany's inability to produce it. Dr. Wilhelm Schaefer, an electronics specialist, shook his head. "The miniaturization alone is beyond our grasp. Our vacuum tubes are too large, too delicate. To fabricate tubes of this minuscule size while preserving functionality and resilience would necessitate manufacturing capabilities we do not possess." Another engineer pointed to the materials analysis. "The casings are fashioned from high-grade aluminum alloys. The circuitry employs copper that shows no indication of scarcity or compromise. Every component is manufactured to specifications we can no longer meet." Becker made notes, then posed the question that weighed heavily on him. "How many of these do you estimate the Americans have produced?" A profound silence fell over the room. Finally, Hedman Weiber spoke. "Based on the accounts from the Ardennes, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. They are employing them as standard ammunition across entire artillery batteries." Becker performed a swift calculation. Each fuse required dozens of precision components: vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, batteries, antenna assemblies, all manufactured to exacting tolerances, all integrated into a device small enough to fit within an artillery shell. And the Americans were producing them in prodigious quantities. "Gentlemen," Becker stated quietly, "we must comprehend the implications. The Americans have not merely devised a new weapon, they have engineered a production system capable of mass-producing complex electronics under wartime duress. While we struggle with basic munitions, they are churning out miniature radar sets by the thousands." One of the senior engineers, a man whose career in German industry spanned back before the First World War, spoke up. "Doctor, with all due respect, I believe you are underestimating the scope. If they can mass produce something this intricate, their industrial capacity surpasses anything we have conceived." Becker knew the engineer was correct, and that realization prompted him to request something unusual: access to broader intelligence concerning American manufacturing. 3 days later, Becker was seated in a secure conference room. Intelligence reports spread before him. What he read confirmed his most dire fears, and then some. The American Fuze program, designated VT for variable time, had been monumental. Intelligence suggested it ranked among the largest wartime undertakings, comparable even to the atomic bomb initiative in its funding. Development had occurred at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, involving hundreds of scientists and engineers. But it was the production figures that made Becker feel physically ill. By late 1944, American factories were manufacturing approximately 40,000 proximity fuses daily. That figure represented more sophisticated electronics than Germany's entire electronics industry could produce in an entire month. And these were not simple devices. Each was a miniature marvel of engineering, more complex than most radios. The fuses were being produced at multiple sites. Western Electric, a telecommunications giant, had reconfigured its production lines for this purpose, as had numerous other electronics manufacturers. The Americans had leveraged their peacetime industrial infrastructure, their expertise in mass-producing consumer electronics, and weaponized it. Becker retrieved German production figures for comparison. In 1944, Germany had produced roughly 40,000 aircraft in total. The Americans were manufacturing more proximity fuses daily than that, and these were merely artillery fuses, a fraction of America's overall wartime output. The intelligence reports contained further disquieting data. The Americans had first deployed these fuses in anti-aircraft roles in 1943, achieving remarkable success against Japanese aircraft and German V-1 flying bombs. The fuses had been kept secret from ground combat precisely to prevent Germany from capturing and reverse engineering them. Their deployment at the Battle of the Bulge suggested one of two scenarios. Either the Americans were so desperate they would risk the secrecy, or they were so confident in their industrial superiority that compromise was no longer a concern. Becker leaned towards the latter. This suspicion was reinforced by another document, a British intelligence assessment of American industrial capacity. The United States was producing more war materiel than all other nations combined. Not just more than Germany, but more than Germany, Britain, the Soviet Union, Japan, and Italy put together. The sheer scale was incomprehensible. One statistic stood out. In 1944, American industry produced over 96,000 aircraft. Germany, with all its vaunted engineering acumen, manufactured approximately 40,000. The ratio exceeded 2-to-1, yet American aircraft were, on average, larger and more complex. A B-29 bomber required more aluminum and man-hours than 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The material disparity was so profound that it rendered tactical and operational skill almost irrelevant. Germany could win every engagement and still lose the war through sheer attrition. Becker realized he was witnessing the mathematical certainty of Germany's defeat. The proximity fuse was not merely a weapon, it was irrefutable proof of an industrial system operating at a level Germany could not approach, let alone rival. Becker spent a week meticulously compiling his findings into a comprehensive report. He understood it would be unwelcome. The Nazi regime was not receptive to pessimistic assessments, but as a scientist, he felt compelled to present the truth as clearly as possible. His report was structured into distinct sections: a technical analysis of the fuse itself, complete with detailed schematics and component breakdowns, an evaluation of Germany's capacity to replicate the technology, which he concluded was impossible with existing resources, and finally, a strategic assessment of what the fuse's existence revealed about American industrial might. The concluding section was the most damning. Becker wrote, "The VT proximity fuse represents not merely a tactical advantage, but a fundamental strategic disparity. The capacity to mass-produce sophisticated electronic devices during wartime signifies an industrial base of unparalleled magnitude and refinement. If American industry can generate 40,000 miniature radar sets daily, while simultaneously producing aircraft, tanks, ships, and conventional ordnance in overwhelming volumes, then Germany's material standing is not merely unfavorable, but mathematically untenable. No measure of tactical skill or soldierly valor can surmount a production ratio of this magnitude." He concluded with a stark recommendation: Germany should pursue an immediate armistice to prevent further casualties in a conflict that could no longer be won. Becker's commanding officer read the report with a somber expression. "Hinrich," he stated, "you are aware this will be perceived as defeatist, perhaps even treasonous." "Should I alter my findings?" Becker inquired, already knowing the answer. "No, the report is accurate. I will forward it through the appropriate channels, but prepare yourself. The leadership does not welcome uncomfortable truths." The report was transmitted to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command. Becker never received a formal reply, but through unofficial channels he learned it had been dismissed as overly pessimistic and defeatist in nature. One general reportedly remarked, "This engineer has been demoralized by enemy propaganda. The American fuse is a stratagem, a stroke of luck, not an indicator of systematic superiority." Becker was unsurprised. He had witnessed this pattern before. Intelligence that contradicted Nazi ideology was invariably rejected, irrespective of the evidence. The regime had been founded on the premise of German technological and racial supremacy. Admitting that America had surpassed Germany in industrial and scientific capability would shatter its entire ideological framework. But Becker knew the truth. He had held the evidence in his hands. He had performed the calculations. Germany was not losing due to inferior soldiers or flawed strategies. Germany was losing because it was engaged in an industrial war against an adversary possessing overwhelming material superiority. No amount of willpower or ideological fervor could alter the laws of mathematics. Becker's report, though dismissed by the High Command, did reach some field commanders. One of them, a colonel leading an artillery regiment, requested a meeting with Becker. The colonel, a veteran of both the Eastern and Western fronts, bore a haunted look in his eyes. "Doctor," he began, "I have read your report on the American fuse. I require confirmation of your conclusions." Becker nodded emphatically. The colonel remained silent for a moment. "My men encountered this weapon during the Ardennes offensive. We lost an entire battalion within minutes, not hours. Minutes. The survivors recounted shells exploding directly above them, that there was no cover, no place to take refuge. At first," he continued, I believed they were exaggerating, that the stress of combat had distorted their perceptions. They were not exaggerating, Becker stated quietly. No, they were not. The colonel leaned forward. Doctor, I have been a soldier for 20 years. I fought in Poland, France, Russia, North Africa, and Italy. I have witnessed every conceivable type of armament. But this changes everything. How does one combat an enemy that can deliver explosives upon your head with pinpoint accuracy, irrespective of weather or visibility? How do you train soldiers to withstand a weapon that renders every defensive position futile? Becker had no answer, for none existed. The proximity fuse had fundamentally altered the calculus of ground warfare. Centuries-old infantry tactics had suddenly become obsolete. The colonel pressed on. And if your report regarding American production is accurate, if they are manufacturing these by the tens of thousands daily, then every offensive we launch, every defensive line we hold, will be subjected to this weapon. We will be systematically obliterated, with no means of resistance. That is correct, Becker confirmed. The colonel stood, gazing out the window at the war-torn ruins of Berlin already ravaged by conventional bombing. Then the war is over. Not officially, not yet, but mathematically, strategically, it is concluded. We are merely awaiting the end. After the colonel departed, Becker sat alone in his office. He reflected on the multitude of brilliant German engineers and scientists who had developed remarkable weaponry: the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, advanced tanks and submarines, all technical marvels. Yet they were marvels produced in limited quantities, often too late, and invariably insufficient in number. Germany had concentrated on quality and sophistication, while America had mastered quantity and reliability. And in an industrial conflict, quantity became its own quality. The proximity fuse was merely one illustration, but it epitomized a broader truth. America was not simply producing more armaments, it was also generating superior logistics, more effective training systems, superior everything, all at a scale Germany could not comprehend, let alone match. Post-war, when production figures were declassified, Becker's estimations proved conservative. He had, in fact, underestimated American capabilities. The ultimate production total for VT proximity fuses surpassed 22 million units. 22 million miniature radar sets, each a complex electronic device, all manufactured in under 2 years of full-scale production. To provide perspective, Germany's total output of all fuse types for all munitions throughout the war approximated 500 million units. However, those were simple mechanical or timed fuses, not intricate electronic devices. The Americans had produced 22 million sophisticated fuses while simultaneously manufacturing hundreds of millions of conventional fuses for other ordnance. The cost of the VT fuse program exceeded $1 billion in 1940s currency, comparable to the Manhattan Project. Yet, unlike the atomic bomb, which was deployed only twice, the proximity fuse was used in vast quantities and had a direct, measurable impact on battlefield outcomes. General George Patton, after witnessing the fuse's effects during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote that it had secured the victory for them. He later opined that it was one of the war's 3 most significant developments, alongside the atomic bomb and radar. The British, who received substantial quantities of VT fuses through Lend-Lease, conducted their own analyses. Their conclusion: the proximity fuse increased the efficacy of anti-aircraft artillery by a factor of 5 and ground artillery by a factor of 3. In essence, each shell equipped with a VT fuse was equivalent to 3 to 5 conventional shells. This force multiplication, combined with America's already overwhelming production advantage, created a scenario where German forces were simply overwhelmed by an avalanche of firepower they could neither counter nor match. Becker survived the war and was interrogated by American technical intelligence officers. They were particularly interested in his 1945 report on the VT fuse. "Did you genuinely conclude from examining these fuses that Germany had lost the war?" an American officer inquired. Becker nodded. "Not solely from the fuses, but from what they signified. The capacity to mass-produce complex electronics during wartime indicated an industrial capability we could not rival. Every component, every specification demanded resources and manufacturing expertise that Germany lacked." "But you were merely examining captured ammunition," the officer pressed. "Surely you could not extrapolate the entire strategic situation from that." "I could, and I did," Becker replied. "When you examine a single element of your adversary's supply chain, and that element is more sophisticated than your most advanced weaponry, and it is being produced in quantities exceeding your total output of similar items, the strategic conclusion is unavoidable." The American officer made notes. "We discovered your report in German archives. It was annotated as a defeatist assessment. No action required." "Did that surprise you?" Becker asked, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "No. In the Third Reich, an accurate assessment of material disadvantage was considered treason. The ideology mandated belief in German superiority regardless of evidence. When reality contradicted that belief, reality itself was dismissed. So, you knew your report would be disregarded?" "I knew," Becker affirmed, "but I had to write it regardless. As a scientist, as an engineer, I felt compelled to speak out about my findings, even if the message was unwelcome." The saga of Hinrich Becker and the VT fuse serves as a stark illustration of Germany's broader strategic miscalculations. Time and again, skilled individuals presented accurate analyses of Germany's worsening predicament, only to be disregarded or penalized. Admiral Canaris cautioned about America's immense manufacturing capabilities, but was disregarded. Albert Speer understood Germany's inability to prevail in a war of attrition, but remained silent. Adolf Galland acknowledged the air superiority of American aircraft and was branded a defeatist. Septrick recognized the impending failure of the Ardennes offensive due to a lack of fuel and was ignored. Now Becker joined that somber assembly. An engineer who meticulously examined captured enemy technology arrived at a precise conclusion regarding the strategic landscape. Yet his insights were dismissed because that reality clashed with Nazi dogma. The pattern was disturbingly consistent and ultimately devastating. The Nazi regime had founded itself upon the fallacies of racial and technological supremacy. When confronted with evidence demonstrating the falsity of these claims, the evidence itself was rejected. Preserving ideological dogma took precedence over acknowledging strategic realities. This deliberate obfuscation extended to the tactical ramifications of the proximity fuse. Even after German forces had been devastated by this weapon during the Battle of the Bulge, even after thousands of soldiers had perished from airbursts against which they had no defense, the High Command refused to concede that this signaled a profound alteration in the nature of warfare. Some commanders insisted it was merely a fortunate development that German troops would eventually adapt to. Others contended that the reports were exaggerated, attributing the soldiers' perceptions to battle fatigue, causing them to overstate the fuse's effectiveness. The notion that America had developed and deployed a truly groundbreaking weapon in such vast quantities was simply too unsettling to accept. Yet, the soldiers on the ground understood. Every German infantryman who survived an artillery barrage in 1945 learned to dread the American projectiles that detonated in midair. Foxholes, the fundamental defensive positions that had sheltered soldiers since the First World War, were transformed into deadly traps. There was no countermeasure, no tactic, no training that could nullify the proximity fuse. Becker's report had foretold this very outcome. He had posited that the fuse rendered obsolete the primary method by which infantry endured artillery bombardments, thereby creating a combat environment where entrenched positions offered no sanctuary. His assessment was precisely accurate. What troubled Becker in the post-war years was the apparent obviousness of his conclusion. The figures were readily available. The evidence was irrefutable. Germany was engaged in an industrial conflict against an adversary possessing overwhelming material superiority, a disparity that no amount of tactical acumen could surmount. The proximity fuse was merely one instance among countless others. American production statistics were accessible through intelligence channels. The United States manufactured well over 300,000 aircraft during the war, while Germany produced approximately 94,000. American shipbuilding output surpassed that of all other nations combined. The volume of American munitions production was so immense that allies such as Great Britain and the Soviet Union were supplied with American materiel even as U.S. forces were engaged on multiple fronts. The arithmetic was harsh and undeniable. Germany was outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outmatched technologically. The advanced weaponry that Germany did manage to produce, such as the Me-262 jet fighter or the Type 21 submarine, arrived too late and in insufficient quantities to exert a meaningful impact. Meanwhile, America was churning out millions of trucks, billions of rounds of ammunition, and, indeed, 22 million proximity fuses. The sheer scale of production was so colossal that waste became an acceptable byproduct. American forces could afford to expend ordnance at rates that would have financially crippled the German war economy. Becker had witnessed this imbalance starkly reflected in the 3 captured shells on his examination table. Each represented a triumph of miniaturization, precision engineering, and mass manufacturing. Each testified to America's attainment of an industrial sophistication that Germany could not replicate, and there were millions more where those had originated. The VT proximity fuse stands as one of the Second World War's most consequential yet least recognized technological achievements. It preserved thousands of Allied lives, initially by defending naval vessels against aerial assaults, and subsequently by decimating German ground forces at pivotal junctures. However, from the German perspective, it represented something far more profound, a stark revelation of their fundamental inadequacy. They were not outmatched by a marginal degree that skill could compensate for, but rather fundamentally and mathematically overwhelmed by an industrial apparatus operating at a magnitude they could not possibly approach. Hinrich Becker was one of many German professionals who perceived this truth and endeavored to convey it. Like the others, he was ignored. The Nazi regime's unwavering adherence to its mythology of racial and technological superiority rendered it incapable of accepting truths that contradicted its ideology. The repercussions of this willful ignorance were catastrophic. The conflict persisted for an additional 4 months subsequent to Becker's submission of his report. Hundreds of thousands more lives were lost, millions more individuals were displaced, and German cities were reduced to ruins, all in the pursuit of a cause that numerous competent professionals had already concluded was mathematically untenable. The lesson extends far beyond the confines of the Second World War. When ideology supersedes evidence, when allegiance is valued above accuracy, and when uncomfortable realities are suppressed rather than confronted, calamitous failure becomes an unavoidable outcome. Becker's analysis of those 3 artillery shells should have precipitated a comprehensive reevaluation of Germany's strategic standing. Instead, it was relegated to obscurity and forgotten. The intelligent munitions continued their relentless descent from the heavens. The inexorable calculus of defeat proceeded with its unavoidable progression, and the Third Reich marched towards its predetermined conclusion, blind to a reality it adamantly refused to acknowledge. The proximity fuse irrevocably transformed the landscape of warfare. However, its examination by German engineers illuminated something even more significant: the fatal consequences of prioritizing ideology over truth, of choosing comforting fictions over inconvenient mathematics. Ultimately, reality remains indifferent to one's beliefs. The intelligent shells unequivocally demonstrated this principle.